What up, though? This your boy DOC. And before we jump into this interview we did with Officer Greg Kading that was over the Tupac case, I want to go ahead and tell you guys to make sure you hit the notification bell and hit all. That's for all my subscribers. And if you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell to get all my alerts and notifications. Now, a while back, we did an interview with Officer Greg Kading. This particular interview was introduced to me by a gentleman named Jay, and we did a little bit of our own research and had a numerous amount of questions that we wanted to ask Greg Kading to get more details about the Tupac assassination, the evidence and affidavits that they used to come up with the conclusions to solve this case almost 20 years later. Now, the gentleman named Jay that introduced this interview to me did most of the questionings. You'll hear me periodically jump in and ask a few questions here and there. But I hope you enjoy it. Make sure you hit like and share. And if you have any other questions that you would like to ask Greg Kading in the future about Tupac and these stories, make sure you drop a comment with those questions. Now here goes the interview.
Thank you for actually taking the time out. You're pretty forthright when I put that Twitter message, which was surprising. But I'm glad that you're so forthright and you're taking the time out to answer our questions. And rather than this be, I guess, a private conversation, I figured it'd be best because some of the questions I had or questions that general fans or people that have been following Tupac and Biggie's story had. So I figured the best way would be to, I guess, share this information, you know, to clear up any confusion or anything like that.
Yeah, all I ask is that you just be fair and honest, and let the information be what the information is, instead of editing it to suit a particular agenda or anything.
Right. I'm not Michael Douglas Carlin. So.
Yeah, because you don't have to agree with me or anything like that, but I think it's just fair to just to let the conversation be what the conversation is in whole, as opposed to.
Right.
So that's all I ask.
Yeah, that's one thing that my channel is known for. I don't do any editing. I put it out in raw form. However it turns out, it's just up to the viewer's interpretation to hear what the conversation was about.
Right on. Perfect. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So I think we should just start with this just for time's sake. So, Greg, can you just start us off with how you got assigned the case?
Sure. So, it's back in 2006, and there's this big lawsuit working its way through the courts in Los Angeles, and the lawsuit was brought on by Biggie Smalls' mother and widow in the estate of Christopher Wallace, based on this theory that LAPD was involved in a corruption and a cover-up of the murder. And so there was a particular time when the judge that was presiding over the case made a comment that, if she should ever weigh on the side of the plaintiff and find that the LAPD was responsible for any of the allegations that were being made against them, it would cost the city hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So that led to a reinvigorated investigation of Biggie's cold case murder, which at that point in time was 9 years old, and that's how I got involved. I was asked to come over and participate in the reinvigorated murder investigation.
Okay. Now, would you say, based on what you said, that I guess you were put on the case, but also in an effort to clear, I guess, the LAPD or the police officers of any wrongdoing or culpability? If as you say, Miss Wallace, she did put the case on with, I guess, that in mind.
So it's not that. It wasn't that the LAPD was saying, hey, disprove this. The police department already had convinced itself that this theory was erroneous and that there was nothing to support it. And the lawyers that were representing the LAPD also were like, hey, it's a baseless lawsuit. There just isn't any evidence to support it. However, you never know what's going to happen in court. You don't know how things are going to play out. And look at the O.J. Simpson trial, for instance. Regardless of how damning the evidence is, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to reach your expected conclusion. And so the LAPD just said, investigate this. They didn't say investigate this and get us off. They just said investigate this. And so that's what we did. We were completely open-minded to the idea of discovering that David Mack and Rafael Perez were the perpetrators or that they were involved in a conspiracy. We would have been happy to find that out. I mean, they're dirty cops, and we love to expose dirty cops. I mean, who sent these guys to jail? We did, And so it just doesn't, it's not a sound idea to think that that we were trying to further cover up something. It wasn't that at all.
Right.
Okay. And how, just in terms of your background, you were already an LAPD detective at this time, and for how many years?
Yeah, so at that point in time, I'd been a detective for years and had been conducting all types of investigations, mostly gang-related homicides. I had a very deep, very deep experience with gang investigations. So at the time that I was asked to join the team to investigate Biggie's murder, I was working major narcotics at that time.
Okay.
And had just gotten done with this really massive federal investigation out here in Los Angeles, very complex case that took us years. And I think because of the reputation that I had built for myself in relation to that case is one of the reasons they sought me out to do this case, because of all the complications with the Biggie case. And so I think they just believed that I was well outfitted to handle the demands.
Right. And I think from what I looked at, was Russell Poole originally assigned the case, and then he was basically told to, I guess, get off the case prior to you picking it up?
Yeah, so back in 1997, after Biggie was murdered, the case was originally being handled by divisional homicide detectives. The very original investigator was a guy named Kelly Cooper. And then when they hadn't solved it in a month, and they knew that they needed a lot more resources in order to make progress in the case, that's when it went down to Robbery Homicide Division. And the Robbery Homicide Division typically does the celebrity and more high-profile L.A. murders, and it's because they have more manpower and more resources than the divisional homicide guys. So when it went downtown a month after the actual murder, Russell Poole and his partner, Fred Miller, were the guys that had been tasked with the case. And Russell worked on it for about 9 months. He was making some very interesting circumstantial connections between certain people, and it was fostering this theory that he was developing. But then what ended up happening with Russell was he got in trouble for something at work. He had a bit of an issue with drinking, and he was having an affair with one of the civilian employees of the department. And he went out one night against his lieutenant's directions, and went out and used his assigned police vehicle to go to a bar and to drink too much. And then he let this civilian who's restricted from driving these vehicles, he let her drive it. So it was just a breach of policy. But those are the types of things that we as cops get in trouble for.
Right.
So he got in trouble for that, and then he was transferred out of the division. And in his mind, he thought, well, this is just a minor infraction. I can't believe you're going to this extreme to punish me. And that fostered even more his theory or his idea about, oh my gosh, I think what's really happening is that I'm making connections that they don't want me to find because it's going to expose a big cover-up, and they're just using this as an excuse to set me aside. Those are the things that were going on with Russell.
Right. Let me jump in there because that was a question I did want to ask you as far as Russell Poole. Now, besides the drinking, if that didn't happen, or I think you said the affair, a lot of people have always asked, how do two police officers like studying the same case come up with like two totally different theories?
Well, I think that I was definitely in a position of advantage because I had all this history to draw from. Russell was investigating this when things were really still unfolding, and he wasn't in a position like I was with all this hindsight and being able to look back at all of the activity that had taken place over that 9-year period. So I was in a much more better position to evaluate things as opposed to the guy who's in the middle of it and not exactly sure what's going on. And unfortunately, Russell fell victim to some jailhouse informants that were providing very erroneous information. I mean, just absolutely lying, and allowed himself to kind of get dragged down these rabbit holes by these informants that were providing false information. And that's where he lost, I think, his objectivity and began to formulate this theory, and it was being supported by the lies of these informants, and, it just got out of hand for him.
Right.
Okay. And did you ever work for the FBI?
Well, I worked in conjunction with them. I was never an FBI agent. I was what we call cross-designated as a federal agent. So when you work on these federal cases, in order to investigate federal statutes, you have to have the authority. So they do what's called cross-designation, where they swear you in as a federal agent, and you are able to now be authorized to conduct federal investigations. And so I had been doing that my whole career. I was always attached to some federal agency, whether it was the ATF or the DEA or the FBI. I was always working with them, but I was not technically an FBI agent that had gone through the FBI Academy and that type of thing.
I got you. Okay. And before you took on this case, were you aware of, the FBI's files they had on Tupac and the fact that he was threatened? He received threats from the JDL, or Jewish Defense League. Did you have knowledge of this prior to taking on this case?
No, not prior to taking on the case, because I would have had no point. There was no purpose for me to be involved in looking into those files or understanding that. But once I was involved in the case, then I had access to everything. And once we decided to marry up and collaborate with the feds and form a federal task force, then you had access to all the federal files in relation to your subjects. And so, yeah, of course, we had access to all of that. And there's this misconception that there's this huge FBI file out there that was, put together on Tupac Shakur. That's absolutely erroneous. The reality is that there's huge FBI files that have to do with black activism and the Black Panthers and all of that. But if you look at the part that has Tupac's files, it's about 4 pages. There's very, very little in there because they were never targeting him. The FBI was never, Tupac in reality didn't pose some massive threat to the federal government. I mean, Tupac was this extremely gifted young rapper, and of course he had his roots in his history, but he wasn't involved in this massive anti-government activism. I mean, that's just as plain as can be. And so, that's just as plain as day. So there's really no foundation to support the idea that he was just such a threat that they needed to neutralize him.
Okay. So I guess in conjunction with that, there was a man named Josh Potash. I think he did his own. I'm sure you heard his name pop up before. And in his research, he stated that he did try to get all the documentation that's out there, and he was told that there were something like 4,000 pages specifically on Tupac by the FBI, but when he ordered it, I guess under the Freedom of Information Act, he only received 99 pages. And he also said there's a lot of information that's obviously crossed out, or the fact that that's not supposed to be read. Do you have any insight as to why he said that, or what that is, or if there is some information that cannot be given under the Freedom of Information Act, what kind of information that would be, where he said that he didn't receive any of that?
Sure. There's a couple of questions wrapped up in there. I'll try to unfold them. So John Potash has developed a theory, and so when you do that, when you have kind of a foredrawn conclusion, then you interpret information to support that theory. This is very much like what Russell Poole did. And you aren't researching from an objective standpoint. You're researching from a standpoint where this is what I believe, and now I'm going to interpret information to support that belief. And ironically, it's funny that we're talking about this right now, because an hour ago in my living room, I was sitting here having a long 3-hour discussion with the author who's been asked by the estate, by Tupac's estate, to write his official biography. And we were discussing this, and he was laughing about how he was able to get his hands on all of these files and how disappointed he was that there was very, very little in those files that pertains to Tupac. And, this is a guy who's tasked with writing the family's biography on behalf of Tupac, and who also had to acknowledge that, man, there's nothing to work with. And so for Potash, I think that, he can say what he wants to say or believe what he wants to believe, but he doesn't understand the reality of the situation. If the FBI has files, and let's say that those files are derived from an informant, and releasing those files exposes that informant to danger, Well, of course, the FBI has a responsibility to protect their informants, and so they're not going to hand out documents to John Potash that he could then publish when it's going to expose people to danger. And so whether it's protecting informants or protecting delicate information or whatever it is, there's reasons for all this. And it's not because there's a big, massive conspiracy or cover-up. It's because law enforcement is acting responsibly by maintaining security over files that, when misused, could lead to harm and danger.
Would Keefe be considered a conformant, correct?
He was for a short period of time. We used him as an informant. So first he is a murder suspect. Here's the evolution of Keefe D. He begins as a murder suspect. He then becomes a murderer because he confesses to the murder. And then we decide that in order to continue to make progress in the case, that we're going to use him as an informant. So we sign him up because there's protocols to all of this activity. And for us to utilize him to make further progress in the case, we have to sign him up as an informant. So he was a suspect, and then he's a confessed murderer, and then he was being utilized as an informant to get the other co-conspirators in.
And this was all done to clear him for his, what was it, a PCP ring that he was running?
Well, no. We were never, the intention was never to clear him of that. The PCP and drug investigation was done as a tool, as a mechanism in order to secure his cooperation. He comes from an environment and a gang culture where, people don't just sit down with the police and say, hey, I'd like to tell you everything I know. He comes from a gang culture where unless you have leverage on them, they don't cooperate.
Yeah.
So we needed his cooperation, and so we used the drugs as a tool to gain that cooperation.
So what were you guys going to offer him in exchange for this information? If he did in fact give you information?
Mm-hmm. Well, he didn't get any kind of immunity from the murder case. All he had was what's called self-incrimination protection. So he didn't have immunity from being charged with murder. We just could not use his own self-incriminating statements to prosecute him. So that's what's called a proffer agreement. These things happen every single day, all across the country with cooperators and law enforcement. So he has an opportunity to do this proffer agreement. Like I said, we've used the drug case against him to get him into that position to make a decision whether to cooperate. And then the exchange is that with your cooperation, if we charge you with these drug cases, when it comes time to sentencing, we'll tell the judge, hey, he helped us out to clear a murder case. Take that into consideration when you sentence him for the drugs. That's the way it works.
Okay. Now, does he still have an ongoing or pending trial on this?
No. The statute of limitations on the drugs ran out. The decision was made once the task force was disbanded and there was no longer an active investigation, then the whole thing was just set aside. The federal government never prosecuted him, which is really unfortunate in my opinion.
I see. I mean, and after the no proffer agreement, I get it that at that time what he says to you, he cannot be, I guess, held in, prosecuted on. But basically, I watched the recent airing of Row Chronicles, and basically the same thing that he told you guys publicly. I mean, and there's two questions around that. I mean, he just basically basically told everyone that he was an accomplice to murder, A, and B, I'm wondering how, after 20-something years, when we saw scores of people dying behind Tupac's murder, he has been walking the streets and still alive. So it's quite a question, but there's some other questions that come to my mind.
Sure. Let me just address those two. So, again, yes, he's protected only from his own statements. He doesn't have immunity, though. If other people come forward and they're good witnesses and they say Keefe D was in the car and he provided the gun and this and that, you can use that to prosecute him. And if other co-conspirators, such as at this point in time when we're interviewing him, Terrence Brown was still alive, the driver. Now, if we got Terrence Brown and he says, I'll cooperate with you guys and I'll testify against Keefe D that he provided the gun, we can use all that for prosecution purposes. We just can't use his own self-incriminating statement. However, when he goes on television like he just did and essentially tops out to being a murder conspirator, absolutely that can be used against him. And the fact that Las Vegas PD has either decided to ignore this or they're so indifferent about it that they're not responding to it, that's shocking to me. I think they have due diligence that they have to take this information, evaluate it, and then react to it. So I don't know if, because and I know I'm being a little bit long-winded here, but I just want everyone to understand what he said on television is just the tip of the iceberg of what actually was recorded that day during his interviews. There's a lot more, and it's all incriminating. It all paints a very clear, decisive, definitive conclusion that Keefe D was a conspirator in the murder. And all Las Vegas has to do is get a court order, take it over to the production office, and say, give us those tapes, and they'll be required by law to hand them over.
Right, and they've done that in the past when people have incriminated themselves, even with Tupac Shakur on TV. When he basically incriminated himself with the producers, what are the names? The Huey brothers, I think. When he went on MTV Rap. So yeah, that's very surprising. And what do you attest to the fact that I guess the streets and everybody's known about Keefe D for 20-something years, but nothing's happened to him?
Well. So that's a little bit, I think, of maybe just a slight exaggeration about the 20 years. So back when this all happened, of course, their inner circle within the Southside Crips, they all knew that Orlando was the shooter. They all knew who was the players and involved. But that's their gang. Those are their boys. So they're protective of that. They're not, they're more interested in the fact that Orlando Anderson stepped up and handled his business. They care more about that than the life of Tupac Shakur. And, this is just sadly the mentality of some of these gang members. However, the mob Pyru, they knew exactly who was involved. Suge Knight looked directly at Keefe D. They'd known each other for years. As a matter of fact, I think during that Row Chronicles, you hear Mob James say, hey, we got the call immediately that it was the Southside Crips. Right. So, he's at the club and he gets the phone call, Pac and Suge just been shot. It's the Southside Crips. But Now, to go find QCD, what does that require? That means some blood is going to have to get in a car, get it done, and now go into enemy territory where there's soldiers posted up on corners. Everybody knows each other, and they know who shouldn't be there. Now, I'm going to go into your neighborhood where you're protected by a whole bunch of people, and I'm going to try to find you and shoot and kill you. The chances are I'm not getting out of there alive.
Right.
So
we definitely do see that.
Okay.
But it's just crazy.
Which that type of actions do happen, because I stay here in Detroit, and that happens all the time. People get hit on their own turf.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we got on both sides. I think we saw people, or even Orlando, got killed, and scores of other people. There were blood taken out, and showed in your crew on top of that.
Yeah. So that's when it's easier just to say it's just a general green light. Hey, it was the Southside Crips. It don't matter if it's Orlando or Keefe or not. Just anybody associated with them, because that's how they see the gang conflict. It's all of those motherfuckers, you know. It's not just like, well, everybody gets a pass, but Keefe and Orlando, we'll go find them. That's just not the way the gang politics work.
Right. And just to go back to the earlier point we were talking about. Now, I think Matulu Shakur, Fani Shakur, in the Josh Kotesh interview, as well, they both stated that the FBI killed Tupac, and in fact, I think he stated that Afeni was scared to tell him or get really deep into it in fear for her life, and after her son died, she kind of stopped being such a political figure or talking about anything. She just wanted to live out the rest of her life in a quiet way, promoting her son's legacy. And Matulu Shakur is another one that said that the FBI was responsible for killing Tupac. And Mo Preem has also stated that Orlando Anderson was just a pawn, as well as Kathy Scott. And hers was the first book I read that came out after Tupac had died, way back, I believe, in the 90s, or maybe in the early 2000s. All of those guys, I mean, what do you attribute to that? Is it because of their background that they're saying this?
Well, certainly with the relatives of Tupac Shakur, you know, they've had their own political issues with the FBI, so it's natural that they would draw those conclusions. But not one of them was there. Not one of them was in a position to know. Not one of them had conversations with the killers. The killers are, you know, presumably their enemies. So, you know, just because they say it and they're people of influence doesn't mean that they know it. It's just like everybody else. They draw conclusions based on their own experience. They draw conclusions based on their own, you know, perspectives. But that's it. They're not witnesses. They don't know anything. They just are speculating based on their own life experiences. But we give them credit just because they happen to be related to Tupac Shakur. And that's just not a good way of, it's just not a sound way of reaching conclusions. You know, just, you know, they're not authorities in the case. They have nothing to do with the case and had nothing to do with the investigations. And so we can draw, you know, we can understand why they would believe that, but it doesn't give us any reason to believe it.
Right.
And with Kathy Scott, she never says that, obviously. Kathy Scott always knew it was Orlando Anderson and that there was, you know, she always just believed it was a simple retaliation for Orlando getting beat down. Now, she dismisses the idea that Puffy was involved.
Right.
But again, she's an outsider that wasn't involved in the intimate details of the investigation, and she didn't have access to all the files and the people that we talked to. So, but she always thought it was simply just Orlando and a gang retaliation.
I kill them. Yeah, I mean, I think from their perspective, they would say something, I guess, to the effect like that most people that are close to the streets would say that the streets talk, and people that are close to the streets know what it is. But And what do the streets all say? All of the streets in Los Angeles, in a position to know, we're like, oh yeah,
a lot of people, like a lot of different people, because I do a lot of tons of interviews. And for some odd reason, which I'm not going to put these people's names out there because I can tell when the subject even comes up, it's still very touchy to certain people around LA and surrounding areas. When they sit back and watch these documentaries, they say, yeah, it's sprinkles of truth in there, but they was like, it's not exactly what it is. And it's like 3 or 4 different people I spoke to, and these 4 individuals don't know each other. It's like that's the normal response that I get. They're like, there's sprinkles of truth in there, but it's not exactly what happened. And then they will just turn around and say the streets of L.A. know what it really is, but it's not fully that.
Okay, so my question would be, I guess my question would be in regard to these people, and no disrespect to them, but what do they know? You know, what do they know? None of them were witnesses. None of them were there. None of them conducted thorough investigation. They're just people that are saying, I have experience on the street, and this is my opinion. And that's all they're offering. So they're just offering an opinion. It doesn't mean anything. There's no value to it. It's just a person's opinion.
Right. When you said that you, before was working narcotics and gangs, gang unit, excuse me, was it normal for a quote-unquote simple gang retaliation to take this long to be, solved?
60% of all gang homicides in Los Angeles go unsolved. 60%.
Right. Yeah, I could do that. Definitely. Did you, in investigating this case, is that the first time you came across Orlando Anderson's name, or did you have previous, dealings with Orlando from being in Los Angeles?
No, because, Compton Police Department was a separate entity from the LAPD. The LAPD didn't provide police services to the city of Compton. They had their own police unit. So, Los Angeles got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of gang members, especially back in the late 80s and early 90s and throughout that era. So Orlando Anderson was not a name of any relevance until he shot and killed Tupac Shakur. And then his name becomes well known. But he's just one of, it's just just another fish in the ocean of gangs.
Right. Just to go along with that, I've watched a couple documentaries, and I forget which two police officers they normally use. I think one's name is Blondie, and I forget what the other guy's name is. And he made a statement like, "Oh yeah, we got Orlando's name. Oh, we know all about him. Like they had numerous run-ins from him." Now, and what I want to get to is that the media and everybody has a certain image of Orlando in its association with the Southside Crips. However, I was reading an article from The Guardian that paints a very different image of Orlando when interviewed by his friends, family, that grew up with him. And some of the things they said was that he was actually a very good student. He was always positive. He's the father of four. They said the guy had no prior convictions, except one time I think he broke into a school or something like that. But he literally had zero prior convictions. He went to Taft High School, a school for high achievers out in the valley. He didn't smoke neither cigarettes nor weed, nor did he drink. And it's not, and unlike a typical gangbanger, they said he was never convicted of any crime prior to this at all. And also, in addition to, and there's a lot more that goes into about Orlando Anderson. And also, in addition to that, I don't know many gangbangers that sue people. When I found out that after Pac had died, and Orlando Anderson sued Pac's estate, I'm like, how many gangbangers do you know that sue people? So I'm just, what do you make of this? I guess what the public perception of Orlando was based on, and then what I just read to you, and statement that I made about Orlando.
So, people can be diverse. People can be multidimensional. And you're probably multidimensional. I'm multidimensional. We all have different elements to our overall character and personality. And it's very true. Maybe Orlando was a smart kid who was a decent student. No problem. He certainly wants to be represented in the best light when you're talking to his family. They're not going to say, yeah, he's just a no-good, two-bit gangster who gave a shit about people's lives. Of course you're not going to get that. But you're going to get that from his family, and they even probably see him to some degree in that light. But when you look at him from the outside in, and you realize that he's already, His own homeboys are telling you about the murders he's conducted. His neighborhood's talking about how much he's bragging about the murder of Tupac. You've got him, of course he sues, but he sues only as a countersuit. He's suing because Afeni has already sued him, saying that he's the murderer of Tupac, which goes to show you exactly what Afeni thought, right? So, there's certain levels and dimensions to all this thing. After this whole thing took place, of course, we know he gets shot and killed in another drug-related gang action where he shoots guys and they shoot and kill him. And so, it doesn't take a lot of effort to see that Orlando Anderson was not the guy that you probably want to be at odds with. Right. And at the same time, think about this. Shortly after Orlando Anderson does this murder, he gets picked up outside of a bank with guns and masks, getting ready to rob a bank. And then, of course, clearly he gets his ass beat down by Tupac and Suge and the entourage, and he goes to court and perjures himself and testifies for $60,000 that Suge was trying to help him. And so you put all this together and you see Orlando Anderson is not a person that we would hail as a pillar of society. He's just a murdering thug who got away with it.
Right. So, just a question: are there records that can be pulled just to see a list of Orlando Anderson's priors?
Yeah, I have some stuff. I got to dig that shit up. But yeah, interview, Ladd, and that's the name of the other guy you were looking for. His name's Ladd. It was Tim Brennan's partner. They worked Compton. They were a gang unit. They were in his neighborhood, frequently. Right. And they knew the kind of person Orlando was and the kind of people he was hanging out with and what he was capable of. So they're not making that stuff up.
Right. And that's kind of where I was, what I was saying, that the police and the media are going to have one depiction of him, but it seems like not even his family, but his friends had another claim of him. And I think BG Knockout, he had kind of vague kind of different, responses when asked about Orlando. He said that Orlando, he was a puppet, basically. He said he was a puppet, and he said basically how the cops do, especially the cops around my way. They plant drugs on you, then they convict you for it, and Orlando was basically being set up. That's what he kind of ensued, but he also kind of made it seem like Orlando was part of them, you know what I mean? He was thorough. So, he kind of gave, different...
Okay, so let me ask you this. You've made a point of the fact that Orlando doesn't have this extensive arrest record. Well, if he's just a puppet and the cops want to do with him, why didn't they just plant guns on him? Why didn't they plant dope on him? Why didn't they do all these things that he's referring to? So it's a little bit of a contradiction for them to say, this is what the cops do. Well,
before or after? You mean before or after? You say before, during this whole time? It might not have happened to Orlando, but that's what I'm saying. It might not have happened just to Orlando because, according to his friends and family, Orlando stayed out of it. He was associated with those guys. Some of those guys were friends, but he stayed out of it. And I guess from what BG is saying, that this is something that they know about in their lives. I'm sure not every single one has been planted drugs on, but I think he was just saying it happens.
I won't argue that. Those were turbulent times, and the cops and the gangs essentially were at war, and the cops I'm not going to lie and say that there wasn't cops that crossed the line and put cases on people. That was the exception to the rule, obviously, but it only has to happen once in order for it to become a problem. One guy who's improperly accused of doing something he didn't do, that's one time too many. And it used to happen. So BG Knockout would be right. That's the environment that he was brought up in, and sometimes cops took that war too far.